Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajam of all ages, we'd heard tales that the mid-season patch might be coming up soon, but I don't think any of us expected it to be next week. That's right, the biggest patch of the season is happening a fair amount earlier than the middle of the season this time around, and we've just had the patch notes released for it, so let's dive into it all and see exactly what is changing, what's being added, what's being fixed, and what's being buffed and nerfed, if anything. And to answer that immediately, a lot of buffs, absolutely minimal nerfs, but there are some. As the devs themselves put here, this was focused around both buffing weaker parts of each class to make the builds that perform worse do a little bit better, while also making it more achievable to complete at least tier 61 Artificer's Pit runs for the final tier of Masterworking materials. The first way they chose to achieve this was by buffing potions just across the board by a pretty large amount, which is actually quite nice, as currently potions actually do very little, so it does help at least a bit. Protector aspect has gotten a slight buff as well, not enough to really make it crazy, but then a number of buffs to different uber unique items, which is actually pretty interesting to see in the middle of the season. Specifically, we got Endariel's Visage now proccing pools under enemies instead of on the player, and a damage increase to it as well. Shadow Explosion damage doubled now for Doombringer 2, and Ring of Starless Skies, with perhaps the biggest buff here, just being allowed to stack in extra time for a bonus 10% resource cost reduction and damage increase. And then Tyrael's Might damage effect just specifically got doubled as well, which is pretty neat for the few builds that actually use it for damage for speed farming purposes. Past that, a pretty major thing here is Paragon board stat node requirements are going down a fair amount for every single board, mostly as a reflection of the loss of the all stats affix on gear, and this is definitely helpful. Some builds, including ones that I've been using, were using non-main stat gems in armor slots purely to hit Paragon thresholds, and this should help at least lower the amount of that we see down a fair bit. Then we have specific individual class changes, which is the bulk of this update. Barbarian has an absolute ton of them, buffs to Whirlwind in general, buffs to Call of the Ancients, as well as to Frenzy and actually surprisingly, Flay. Flay is partially responsible for one of the strongest Artificer's Pit pushing builds right now, so it's quite interesting to see this, but it does sort of show that their priorities for balancing are more towards the average player than towards specifically the top end. But Flay is now just way more usable across the board for sure. Then they also changed some passives, adding in weapon mastery skills to the pressure point passive, which is actually pretty solid for a lot of builds. Then Tough as Nails just getting a numerical increase, then a change to the Walking Arsenal key passive, increasing the damage buff that it gives by 2% per weapon type, which is actually pretty solid as a whole. Then we have changes to legendary aspects and uniques, with the most notable ones being the Slaking aspect, now applying to all core skills instead of just Rend, as well as increasing your maximum fury. Whirlwind Dust Devils getting doubled in damage, and then the Relentless Armsmaster aspect now also gives 15% reduced fury cost while active too. Gore's Grips, as a unique, got a reasonably sizable buff, as did the damage increase buff from Ancient's Oath, though that one will still struggle to find a place in endgame builds due to it being a two-ended weapon. Moving on from there, then we have Druid changes, a bunch of Spirit Boon adjustments to start with. Advantageous Beast now also gives movement speed, which is quite neat. Scythe Talons, Iron Feather, and Swooping attacks, which were all meta picks for Spirit Boons before, got buffed a pretty massive amount here too. Same with Bolster, and Obsidian Slam having its kill requirement cut in half is actually genuinely quite good as well. For actual skill changes, Rabies got another number buff, it's hard to say exactly how useful it'll be. Pulverize got a pretty massive damage buff, and a buff to the Raging Pulverize enhancement to give the skill a bonus 30% multiplier on overpower hits. Then for passives, Nature's Fury got a buff, as well as the Perfect Storm key passive, which actually got a pretty sizable one. Nature's Reach got a buff, as did Toxic Claws, both also meta passives for different builds. Quick Shift as well, but Mending is the interesting one to me now, which also now gives bonus maximum life, which is honestly great to see more of for Druid, and a buff to Provocation is lovely to see too. Then we have just some legendary aspect changes, buffs to the Trample Slide builds by a pretty reasonable amount, as well as a buff to both Wolf Companion based builds and Shred builds too. Then just some Paragon changes to finish it off, a buff to Constricting Tendrils, which is pretty powerful already, and a buff to Dominate, which is lovely to see too. Overall, just a bunch of either new multipliers or better multipliers for Druid, and this should help boost a number of builds up a fair bit in power. Then we have Necromancer, starting with a ton of buff to the majority of the sacrifice bonuses in the game to just sort of try and make them actually worth using. As of course, ideally you would want both minions and sacrifice playstyles to both be relatively balanced between each other. Then past that, just some Paragon changes, mostly numerical, but some honestly pretty impactful within here too. And then a couple of legendary aspect changes, buffing both the Sacrificial and Shielding Storm aspects. Past that is Rogue, buffs to both Twisting Blades and Flurry as core skills, notable buff to Exposure as a passive, as well as buffs to both Sturdy and Mending creating obscurity. Various buffs to Paragon glyphs as well, including making fluidity, also give a damage multiplier buff, which is quite nice to see. Then we have just a ton of legendary aspect changes, Blade Dancers, which is a crazy thing to see buffed without the context of this season, of course, and then a ton of changes to grenade-based aspects, some changing the actual drop locations of the effect of the grenades, but mostly just buffing the grenade's actual damage. As well, a relatively major one is the Umbrous aspect, no longer requiring it to be using marksman skills to activate, which immediately brings melee rogue builds at least a little bit closer in comparison, at least compared to what it has been, because this is a lot of defense that they can gain. Aside from that, a couple of unique buffs. Eyes in the Dark not only now gives the further increased damage, but will also now always cause Death Trap to trigger twice, which is quite solid. And then again, another grenade damage buff in here too. Then for the final class today, we have Sorcerer. Very little as far as active skill changes, but this includes buffing Ice Armor in a sort of unusual way, but there are at least quite a lot of buffs throughout the passives, including Potent Warding, no longer excluding base skills, further cooldown reductions from overflowing energy, massive further damage multipliers from Avalanche, and even buffs to things like the key passives of Shatter, which were in use in top tier pit pushing builds anyways. Past that, some legendary aspect and unique item changes too, mostly numerical aside from Mage Lords, which now gives a minimum default amount of damage reduction and gives its maximum amount to you if even one enemy is in close range, which is just a good change for sure. Then for uniques, it's fully numerical changes really, but again, just generally buffs here. Then moving on, just a couple of further changes really with the patch, first being that health and damage of all monsters in the pit has been adjusted by a fairly decent amount, especially around the tier 60 mark, just to make sure that more players can access the full extent of masterworking really. As well, all of the tormented level 200 bosses are getting a full 30% life reduction, including the Echo of Lilith and her bonus spawns as well. Then finally, just some bug fixes. Pour one out for the Holy Boats Necromancers out there, because this bug has finally been caught and exterminated, but also congratulations to Boulder Druid enjoyers, as this one has again been fixed and even actually buffed a strange amount from this bug fix as well. Then just a fix to some issues with Scoundrel's Kiss and to the fact that the new pets counted as minions for whatever reason. And that just about does it then for today everyone. Just a quick roundup of the patch notes for 1.4.3, the mid-season patch for Season 4 of Diablo 4, and my thoughts on them. Overall, I think this is quite nice to have a patch like this that is nearly all buffs, especially one that is coming literally next week, but I will say it does feel a bit sad to not have new items in a mid-season patch like we've had in previous ones, and more importantly than that, the actual balancing split does feel more than a little bit off. Again, like I said earlier, it might be that they are just balancing more around average players and equipment rather than the high end, but one of the best performing pit builds that we have had gotten buffed from this patch, and it specifically said that the patch was out to buff weaker playstyles. Sure, Druid got a ton of buffs to meta stuff, but relatively speaking, Druid as a whole was weak, so it was deserved, whereas something like Barbarian probably didn't need quite the amount of love that it's gotten right now, and I say that as a Barb main this season. Overall, I think all of this serves a purpose of trying to bring the various builds in the class closer in line with each other, because if a class is balanced within itself, it's just easier to shift numbers around to make the class as a whole fit better with the other classes too, which seems to me to be the way that they are aiming to do this. How about you then? What do you all think about these changes? Let us know down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.